Welcome back. Today we're going to do the second of our lectures on video games and how they shape the computer industry. And this one is about a game I grew up loving called Pong, and Nolan Bushnell, the guy who invented it. Nolan Bushnell, who grew up near Salt Lake City, was a space war fanatic. That game that the people like Steve Russell and his friends had invented at MIT, at the MIT Tech Model Railroad Club. And he grew up playing that game at the computers that he could find, the PDP-1 computers that he could find at the University of Utah. But it wasn't just computers he loved. Nolan Bushnell also loved pinball machines. He loved going to penny arcades. He loved going to amusement parks. He played poker, and at one point he lost enough money that he needed to work in an amusement park at night in order to pay his tuition at the University of Utah. But it was good for him. He began to see exactly what type of games appealed to people, and as a space war fanatic, he began to dream that maybe he could create a new type of arcade game, not some mechanical pinball machine, but a way to take computer games and turn them into an arcade game. And by doing so, he was not just an inventor, but he was a marketer and salesman and an entrepreneur and an engineer. He figured out how to make these machines. He rolled that all together to be the type of entrepreneur that turns an invention into an industry. He was lucky to be at the University of Utah, which had the best computer graphics department, I think, of any university in the United States at the time. There was a professor there named Ivan Sutherland. Alan Kay was there. He would go on to Xerox PARC, where he would help create the graphical user interface. And while at the University of Utah, this is when Nolan Bushnell figures out, I can simplify this complicated software program that makes space war, and I can do it mainly in hardware, in a pretty simple machine that he called, computer space. And he built the shell for it, he made it beautiful, and he simplified the game a bit because he didn't have enough processing power. He wasn't going to buy a $20,000 PDP-1 computer from DEC to run inside of this thing. And so it was mainly done with the hardware, which meant that there was only one spaceship that you could actually maneuver. The other was kind of constant, that there was no gravitational field. There was no hyperspace that you could escape into, but it was still a pretty fun video game. And he turns it into this machine that he's able to market with his great marketing skills and puts into a bar in Menlo Park, which is in Silicon Valley near Palo Alto, the Dutch Goose Bar. And it launches an industry because up until then, arcade games had all been sort of the pinball machines that were made by 2 or 3 mafia-dominated companies in Chicago. But suddenly, because of Nolan Bushnell and Computer Space, which was the name of this game, it would be transformed into an industry that would have Silicon Valley and software at its heart. Even though he had simplified the game to get it all into a machine without a huge computer inside, it wasn't all that simple. It had a lot of instructions about the flying saucers and how to play the game and which button to hit to fire the missile and steering control and thrust control and all that. So it was more popular in college town bars than it was in working class bars. And so what Nolan Bushnell decides to do is create an even simpler game that will be far more popular because it will have no instructions. He creates a company, names it Atari, after some Japanese word that he liked, and he hires a young engineer on the far right with the bushy beard, a guy named Al Alcorn. There's another engineer on the left, Ted Dabney. But basically, Al Alcorn and Nolan Bushnell become best friends as they create the company Atari and the game that launched it, the game called Pong. Usually when you have a partnership that works to create a good startup, people have different talents, just like Andy Grove had different talents from Gordon Marr and Robert Noyce at Intel, or Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had very different talents. In this case, Nolan Bushnell and Al Alcorn were two peas in a pod, both boisterous, fun-loving, exuberant engineers who knew how to market things. And the game they create, called Pong, starting in the early 1970s, is just a very simple game. A blip goes back and forth on the screen, and you use the paddle to try to keep the blip from going into the goal. You bounce it back and forth, playing against another player as if it were ping pong. And Al Alcorn and Nolan Bushnell come up with some clever ideas to make it more fun. They create a little sound, a thunk, as soon as it hits the paddle, which was hard to do in the minimal amount of hardware they were putting into this machine, but they knew the thunk would make it so that people could relate to the game more. And the ball spins and moves in a different way if you hit it in the middle of the paddle or the edge of the paddle. And so it becomes very successful, and it becomes, unlike computer space, a game that is simple. It needs no instructions. In fact, the only instruction on the front of the game was avoid missing ball in order to get high score. There were no other things you had to figure out what to do, no complicated buttons and throttles, just a simple thing that a stoned freshman could figure out after midnight in a bar and play. They put it in a bar called Andy Capp's near Stanford University, and they want to see how well it does. The next day, the owner of the bar calls Nolan Bushnell, angry, and says, "Your damn machine quit working." Nolan Bushnell rushes to the bar, tries to figure out what's wrong, opens up the front of the machine, and a gusher of quarters spills on the floor. The problem was the game had been so popular the night before, it had gotten jammed with quarters. That's when Nolan Bushnell knew that he had a winner on his hands, and he created his own manufacturing space with hot tubs and sort of Friday afternoon parties with a little bit of dope and beer and everything else, and a whole lot of ne'er-do-wells and young geeks and hackers from around Silicon Valley come work at Atari and help build this machine. They bootstrap this company. As they build machines, they sell them, and they use that to invest in order to create more. Among the people who worked at the night shift at Atari in the early 1970s, Steve Jobs, that's him on the left, and Steve Wozniak, his friend and neighbor from down the street. At Atari, they learned a couple of very important lessons. One was that simplicity was the secret to success. Steve Jobs said, "I will never create a computer that needs a manual. It should be like Pong, avoid missing ball to get high score. Just that simple. And it should be fun. There should be graphics and sounds and moving things so that a computer will be as fun as the video game." Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, while on the night shift, the first thing they do is they create a new form of Pong that's only a single player game. It was called Breakout. You just hit the ball against the wall and tried to break out the bricks. Steve Jobs tells Wozniak, "You gotta program this game by the weekend because we want to go up to the apple farm where they were working." Wozniak stays up 3 nights in a row and programs the game of Breakout. They go to the farm, and of course, they start their own company named after the apple farm called Apple. Years later, There's Steve Wozniak on the left, and that's Nolan Bushnell, reminiscing about how in that shed that Atari created, the computer industry was born out of the video game industry. Thanks.